Hi everyone, thank you for joining. We'll just give it a few more minutes to allow more people to join before we start. Great, I think we can get started. So hi everyone, thank you very much for joining Airfinity's webinar today. Our webinar is called From Science to Strategy, Making RSV, hMPV and PIV Vaccines Work in the Real World. My name is Selina Kim and I'll be moderating today's discussion. I'm currently a senior epidemiologist at Airfinity, leading the RSV team, and I'm greatly excited to be joined by three fantastic panelists today. Before we start, I'll just highlight that the webinar will be recorded and sent to you via email afterwards, and it will also be uploaded onto the Airfinity company YouTube channel. There will be some time for some questions at the end of our discussion, so please send these in using the chat function and we will go through them at the end. So for some background, for those of you who may not be familiar with Airfinity, Airfinity is a leading AI-powered drug and disease forecasting company, providing real-time insights to predict and simulate scientific, commercial, and epidemiological outcomes. Although our headquarters are in London, our forecasting expertise is leveraged by decision makers in companies and organizations across the world. I'm now very excited to introduce you to our panelists today. We first have with us Dr. Marco Cavaleri. Dr. Cavaleri is Head of Biological Threats and Vaccine Strategy at the European Medicines Agency. He's a pharmacologist with extensive experience in infectious disease research, vaccine strategy, and regulatory science. Before joining the EMA, he spent several years in research and development for anti-infectives in the pharmaceutical industry. We also have joining us today Professor Mark Jitt. Professor Jitt is chair and professor at the Department of Global and Environmental Health at New York University. He's an expert in infectious disease epidemiology and health economics, specializing in vaccine modeling to inform public health decisions. It is a great honor to host Professor Jitt today, as I've also had the pleasure of being taught mathematical vaccine modeling by him at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, where he was previously a professor prior to his current role. His research has shaped global immunization policies covering diseases such as COVID-19, measles, hPV, and RSV. And finally, we also have Emmanuel Hanon joining us today, who is CEO of London-based biotechnology company Vicebio, which has RSV, hMPV, and RSV, hMPV, PIV3 vaccines in development. Emmanuel Hanon is a vaccine research and development leader with over 20 years of experience in vaccines development, regulatory strategy, and manufacturing. He played a key role in the GSK-Novartis merger and led global vaccines research and development at GSK for many years, overseeing the development of major vaccines. Thank you all very much for joining our panel. We're all very excited for this without a doubt, what will be a very interesting discussion. I'm going to first give a brief overview to the audience of RSV, hMPV, and PIV, of the virus characteristics, and some of the key considerations that we believe will be important in the development and rollout of combination vaccines. So what are RSV, hMPV, and PIV? Well, these three viruses all belong to the same family, Paramyxoviridae. They all carry a negative sense single-stranded RNA genome, meaning that they must undergo transcription before translation and rely heavily on host machinery for replication. This is a key consideration in therapeutic targeting. In terms of transmission, they will spread primarily through respiratory droplets and direct contact. And clinically, they all cause both upper and lower respiratory tract infections. Symptoms range from mild cold-like illness to more severe conditions like bronchiolitis, pneumonia, and wheezing. And RSV and hMPV are often indistinguishable based on symptoms alone, while PIV V, on the other hand, particularly subtypes 1 and 2, is especially known for causing croup in young children. Lastly, in terms of the at-risk populations, they are very similar, typically in the infants and the elderly. However, while RSV is highest in neonates and infants, there is increasing evidence that hMPV and PIV cause great burden in toddlers. So despite being distinct viruses, RSV, hMPV, and PIV all share a common clinical and epidemiological footprint, one that makes them very important targets for both diagnostics and therapeutic development. So what preventative therapies are actually currently available? Well, we know that for several years, the only immunization available against RSV was monoclonal antibodies in neonates and infants, and these remain for use in pediatrics today. But since 2023, we have entered a new era for RSV prevention. We've seen 3 vaccines approved for use in the older adult populations, and as of recently for high-risk adults in Europe as well now, and 1 maternal vaccine approved for use as passive immunization in infants. While there are now several options to protect against RSV, as you can see on the map, there are no approved hMPV or PIV prophylactics. This leaves a large gap for the prevention of the diseases of these 2 viruses. And with the similarities in viral genomics, populations at risk, and seasonality to a certain extent, creating a combined vaccine for 2 or 3 of these viruses could really prevent a large burden of morbidity and mortality. So what combination vaccines are being developed? Well, here we're looking at the pipeline of the candidates being developed targeting RSV, hMPV, and PIV. And we can see that most candidates are in fact targeting RSV and hMPV, with AstraZeneca's phase 2 candidate, IVX-A12, currently being the most advanced in development, with potential approval in 2027. However, we also have Vicebio, Clever Biopharmaceuticals, and Sanofi developing trivalent vaccines against RSV, hMPV, and PIV3, with PIV3 typically the most prevalent subtype out of the 4 PIV subtypes, and it's also often associated with more severe disease such as pneumonia and bronchiolitis. I think what's also interesting to point out here is that we know Moderna's bivalent vaccine, mRNA-1365, targeting RSV and hMPV, has been discontinued in infants younger than 2 years old, following an imbalance seen in the rates of severe RSV disease in their phase 1 trial in July. This also led to the FDA placing a clinical hold on all RSV vaccine trials in young children. I think this really emphasizes the importance of safety in vaccine development, which will be one of the key focuses of our discussion today. Moving on, I'm just going to give you a short overview of some of the key considerations that will be important in the development of RSV, hMPV, and PIV combination vaccines, which we hope to cover in the panel discussion. So if we look at the relative burden of RSV and hMPV, focusing here on just older adults, meta-analyses have found that RSV global hospitalization burden is higher than in hMPV. But I think what's important to note is that the true burden of both of these diseases is very much often underestimated, and it could be even more underestimated for hMPV than for RSV. hMPV testing is only prioritized for high-risk patients, and it's often not included in many rapid point-of-care tests. And I think what's also important to note is that the majority of this hMPV burden is concentrated in low and middle-income countries, similar to RSV. Improving both the frequency of testing and the types of testing, such as adding these additional types of samples to nasopharyngeal swabs alone, could greatly improve the detection of the real burden of both of these viruses. And on the right here, we have some studies that compare the relative hospital burden of RSV to hMPV. These estimates are from single studies, so of course these can't be used to generalize absolute burden within countries, but I think this highlights that there can be great variation in the relative burden of RSV and hMPV, and differences in surveillance and reporting are likely a big driver of these patterns. And we hope to discuss its impact in understanding the burden, as well as its impact on vaccine development and regulatory processes as well. I want to touch upon seasonality. So here we're looking at the US and the UK as an example, and this is comparing the test positivity of the three viruses to each other. And we can see that while these viruses are seasonal, there can be quite a high amount of divergence between their circulation in a typical season. For example, in the US, we can see that the gap between an RSV peak and the peak in PIV can be up to 6 months within a particular season. And so this places emphasis on the importance of lasting protection against these three viruses in combination vaccines. I'm going to present some data on what we have. In terms of what data is available for hMPV protection, it is limited. So we have here hMPV immunogenicity data from AstraZeneca's IVX-A12 from interim phase 2 data that was first presented at ID Week in October, and also recently again at the ISIV conference last month. So here we're looking at geometric mean titers of neutralizing antibodies in their trial in 60 to 85-year-olds vaccinated with IVX-A12 with no adjuvant. And what we can see is that at 6 months, the neutralizing antibody titers for hMPV appeared to potentially wane faster than that for RSV. Antibody titers being relatively close to baseline at month 6. If in the case that these neutralizing antibodies are a correlate of protection, this could have implications for the durability of protection against hMPV in combination vaccines. And this could have implications in countries such as the US, where hMPV can circulate up to 4 to 5 months after RSV. If this is the case, what would be appropriate rollout strategies? And would different countries need to require different strategies depending on their different seasonality? Finally, I want to highlight the impact of safety. So we know in the case of RSV that there has been increasing real-world data that may indicate that there are elevated risks of Guillain-Barré syndrome associated with the protein subunit RSV vaccination. GBS is a rare neurological disorder where the immune system attacks the peripheral nervous system and can cause muscle weakness and sometimes paralysis. The US Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, ACIP, has stated that this risk has played a role in their risk-benefit assessments and in their decisions in recommending to younger adult age groups, as well as potential decisions for revaccination as well. And we know that for RSV, it remains recommended as a lifetime dose across countries. So in the context of combination vaccines, safety will play a key part in risk-benefit evaluations taken by national immunization groups, NITAGs, and health technology assessment agencies in their recommendation, and we hope to discuss this further. So having touched upon some of these considerations, I think it's only fair that I turn to our experts in the panel to hear from their expertise and to hear ultimately what we think will bring these combination vaccines to the clinic and into the arms of the high-risk people who need them. So, starting with epidemiology, I'd like to ask you, Professor Jitt, in terms of sort of the great amount of research that you've done, particularly around cost effectiveness and cost effectiveness strategies for RSV immunization, you've previously stated that seasonality often drives cost effectiveness of vaccine strategies. So can you speak a bit more about this, please, on what you think seasonality will have in its role in determining what the most cost-effective strategies will be for these combination vaccines?
Sure. Well, thanks for inviting me to speak. In terms of the seasonality and its impact on the cost effectiveness of different strategies, I think in the literature, various studies have shown that seasonal strategies could be more cost effective in countries that have a distinct and reasonably regular RSV season. But the way this has translated into guidelines differs. For instance, with maternal vaccination, the UK recommends giving the maternal vaccine year-round, but in the US, a sort of more seasonal strategy with nirsevimab given from October to March. Beyfortus is from October to March is recommended. So I think it's a balance of different considerations. The enhanced cost effectiveness and impact you'd get from a seasonal strategy is balanced from the sort of probably the ease of implementing the strategy. If you want a seasonal strategy, you need to give the sort of right direction so that providers will give the intervention at the right times and not other times. And also how much burden there is off season, because you're not going to affect that if you take a seasonal strategy. Then if we're thinking about a combination vaccine, then you'd have to have a seasonal strategy that is broad enough that you can cover the time when each of the viruses are circulating. So in order to do that, you'd need pretty good epidemiological surveillance. I mean, you've shown data from the US and UK, which have reasonable virological surveillance for respiratory infections. But in other countries, they won't have the same seasonality. So they'd need good surveillance. And I mean, studies have shown that in some of the larger countries, even within the countries, you can get different regions with different types of seasonality. For instance, in China, there is at least several sort of like different regions with different seasonality for RSV. And so if you were to use this seasonal strategy, you'd have to have different guidelines for different areas of the country. So all this complexity has to be balanced off the cost effectiveness as well.
Yes, thank you. That's very informative. And I think that brings me on to my next question for Dr. Cavaleri, which I think is very related to your comment on sort of the variation both between countries and also within countries, so inter and intra regional variation. Dr. Cavaleri, for you, do you think that combination vaccination strategies based on this sort of evidence of varying seasonality, do you think that these strategies will need to be localized in terms of the local epidemiology, or do you think that they could be standardized similar to the autumn campaigns that we have for flu and COVID?
Yeah, I think that in principle, it would be desirable to standardize these as much as possible. But of course, you know, we need to take into account how much differences have an impact then on the potential use of these vaccines, these combination vaccines. And therefore, all these consideration around epidemiology, and also very importantly for how long the vaccines will protect, because that is something that of course we don't know at the moment, and we need to understand that, because only with these elements at hand it will be possible really to tease out a strategy that and see whether this can be applied in diverse locations, or whether there will be a need for, you know, more tailored use of this vaccine depending on the region. So I think it's too early to say, and we need to be open to different type of scenario. But as I always say, with combination vaccine, there is always a need of some compromise. You know, you cannot have something that covers perfectly all the different pathogens, and we need really to understand that and figure out what is the most reasonable strategy that could be implemented in this respect.
Great, thank you. And Emmanuel, from a manufacturing and logistics perspective, as a vaccine developer yourself, how could these regional variances impact the production and sort of the rollout of these vaccines? Are there specific risks, whether, you know, regulatory or supply chain, when we transition away from a globally synchronized schedule to a more region-specific one? I think you're on mute, Emmanuel.
Excuse me, I was on mute. No, I was saying thanks a lot for giving me the opportunity to speak to the webinar. I think we have actually two different scenarios in front of us. Either manufacturer, developer can set up vaccines, multivalent vaccine that offer multi-year protection. And if this is that scenario that is achievable, I think actually we can rely on, and obviously the vaccine needs also to be stable long enough. But in that sense, you could you would not have really to think about having a tailor-made manufacturing depending on the season. You could rather have a centralized where you manufacture your vaccine, and you have a shelf life that is long enough so that you can use the vaccine all along the year. But that's only in the case when you can demonstrate that your vaccine is able to offer multi-year protection. It looks like the vaccine that have been recently launched, at least 2 of the 3, They have shown actually more than at least 2 years of protection. One of them even showed 3 years of protection with a slight decrease in protection, but still a significant level. And so again, for combination vaccine, it's going, any additional valency you add to the monovalent vaccine needs to match that persistence of protection. Otherwise, you are back to the need to make a seasonal vaccination campaign with all the complexity and the challenge that has been just mentioned from an epidemiological point of view, looking at the spread of these different viral infection, looking also at the persistence of protection, and also the big challenge of vaccinating a lot of people at the beginning of the season against influenza, against COVID, and possibly against another stream of viruses. That logistically is very challenging. So if it's possible to make a vaccine with a long protection from a manufacturing point of view, it would be way much simpler. And I would also say desirable for public health authorities to be able to vaccinate people in a way independently of the season.
Yes, great, thank you. And can I just follow up with you, Emmanuel, as a developer yourself, are you able to speak a bit as to how these formulations are being designed to ensure as robust season-long protection as possible for these different viruses?
Yeah, so this is going to be valid whether it's respiratory syncytial virus, hMPV, or PIV. These vaccines are designed very differently in a way than the way influenza vaccine and COVID vaccine are being made. For influenza and COVID, every year you have to update in a way the vaccine because you raise a protection that is close to be strain specific. These new vaccine, RSV, hMPV, PIV, are rather designed in a way that the target of the immune system is exposing to the immune system highly conserved cross-reactive epitope so that you get an immune response that goes across the different strain, the possible strain that can circulate. With that strategy, provided you can raise an immune response that is high enough, you can actually hope to get indeed a multi-year protection. It has been shown for RSV that it's achievable. And obviously, we are very busy in trying to expand the knowledge that has been accumulated on RSV on other viruses to try to achieve the same.
Yes, great. Thank you for that. I think just to stay within sort of the epidemiology realm, I think I'd like to ask Mark sort of related to the surveillance and underdiagnosis of hMPV in relation to RSV, how do you think this could hinder potential vaccine impact modeling and sort of making the case for reimbursement by NITAGs and HTAs?
Well, the degree of underreporting is variable depending on the setting we're looking at and the kind of outcome we're looking at. So in places with good access to care and hospital surveillance, I think many countries do a decent job at understanding the burden of acute respiratory illness in hospital and the mortality associated with that. Well, then you have to determine which pathogens are causing the respiratory burden. But in countries with laboratory surveillance as well of virological surveillance, you don't have to have complete virological surveillance. You can use statistical models to estimate the proportion of that burden which is due to different viruses. I think the challenge is in settings where either there's not good ARI surveillance in hospitals and or a lot of the mortality occurs outside of hospitals. I mean, there's a third element, which is the home treated cases that never reach healthcare. But I think in countries with good access to care, those tend to be not as severe cases. So maybe those aren't the main focus of the vaccination or monoclonal antibody programs. So in countries where there's a lot of mortality outside of hospitals or maybe incomplete hospital surveillance, I think what we really need are actual actively followed cohorts of individuals, whether it's infants, children, older adults, to regularly test them. And that will give us complete reporting. And then when it comes to then understanding the burden, well, there have been sort of global and regional meta-analyses that then sort of pull data from different countries and look at the sort of quality of the studies in different countries. So countries which have had these active cohorts followed up could then be used to understand underreporting in other countries. So, but obviously, the more of these studies we have, the better. I mean, because we're basically extrapolating across different settings, and the epidemiology, the burden might not be the same in every setting. So the more of these studies we have, the better we'll understand the burden, and therefore the better the economic models can be.
Definitely, thank you. I think sort of related to that, when we talk about sort of the timing of these viruses, and again, the increasing importance of durability in ensuring that you can have this protection that will last throughout the season. Perhaps Marco and Emmanuel, can you comment on what you think a potential acceptable efficacy threshold could be for these hMPV and PIV components? Appreciate this is a very difficult question, but if there's sort of any thoughts you can give there, that would be great.
Yeah, it is a difficult question. And of course, we will have to understand what this vaccine can achieve. But I guess, the starting point would be to achieve an efficacy that is pretty much similar to what we got with the RSV vaccine. That is what would be desirable. So designing study that would go in this direction and making sure, that the vaccine that we have could achieve that would be a good starting point. Then, as always, this will have to be discussed case by case with regulators to understand how to design pivotal trials. And what would be, the margin also for declaring success in a phase 3 trial. And as you know, here we are quite liberal in this respect, but it's pretty obvious that if the vaccine will have a point estimate of 50% or less, it will not make a good case for then being used in vaccination campaigns. And when I say 50%, of course, here we will need also to understand if this is the entire protection that we are getting from the combo vaccine, or whether it is for each of the antigens included. And that also is not a minor point that will have to be discussed with regulators to really see how to design the pivotal clinical trials and what will be the primary outcome. Of course, since it's a combination vaccine, the beauty of it would be that, you have an impact on a burden of disease that is not only for a single type of virus, but it's multiple viruses. So I would like to look at the entirety of the impact of the vaccine before looking into what are the merits and the pros and cons of each antigen.
Yeah. To complete actually the previous answer, I think an important word to mention here is what we call cost effectiveness. At the very end, what makes a vaccine being used is that it obviously has obtained approval, so shown to be efficacious and safe, but also judged by health authorities as a cost-effective intervention. And in that sense, it really looks like, but this will need to be confirmed by additional epidemiological study that estimate the real impact of these different diseases. I mean, it's not a joke. It's a reality. When I started to work on respiratory virus vaccines a long time ago, I remember one of my boss basically not believing that there was so much RSV cases. It was like, it wasn't really believing it. It was an important vaccine to develop. And when I look now how much we realize it's important, and the same potentially for hMPV, epidemiological study will be really critical. But beyond that, I think the other aspect we should not underestimate is that a combination vaccine is something that, from also the cost of the administration, the simplicity of administration, the convenience for patient, the convenience for pharmacist or doctor that administer the vaccine, all these different aspects can also, from a public health perspective, have contribute a lot to basically the benefit that is provided by the intervention. And so I think, besides the need to further confirm epidemiological dimension of each of these viruses, if confirmed, I think there is a strong case, provided we can indeed generate vaccines with high efficacy that persist multi-year. There is a strong case to develop and offer to the patient a highly cost-effective intervention that would really prevent people to go to hospital.
Yes, that's a great point. Thank you. And I think related to that, Emmanuel, you say that obviously a big benefit of these combination vaccines is being able to, reduce the number of doctor visits. You ultimately get 3 vaccines in one, right? We're seeing that GSK and Pfizer are increasingly pursuing the investigation of co-administration of their respective RSV vaccines with the herpes zoster vaccine shingles. Do you believe, I think this is a question for everyone, that we can see these RSV hMPV vaccines be co-administered with the flu and COVID vaccines? And if so, do you also maybe have any concerns around potential antigen competition there?
So, first of all, today we have for older adults above 60 years old, potentially 3 vaccines being recommended. Influenza, COVID-19, and RSV monovalent. It's already one too much because the reality is that in the US, for example, people are getting vaccine in one shot in one arm, potentially a second shot in the other arm, but they stop there. So this is actually one of the strong case and my strong belief that the respiratory virus vaccine field is going to evolve towards combination, both flu and COVID together on one end as a seasonal vaccine and RSV hMPV PIV as another offer, highly cost effective. And I think really with 2 shots, you could offer protection against 5 diseases. I'm obviously well aware of, let's say, the short-term opportunity to demonstrate the fact that co-administration are working. It's simply basically offering flexibility for pharmacist doctor with using the monovalent vaccine, but the one that will be able to combine and put together those that needs to be combined together will always have a preference, especially if the presentation is in addition in a prefilled syringe rather than coming into multi-vial and stuff like that.
Great, yes. Mark, do you have anything to add to that, or?
No, except, I mean, from well, not talking about the manufacturing or development challenges, since that's not my area, but from a cost effectiveness and, well, I think even acceptability point of view, obviously a combination vaccine is better than co-administration.
Yeah, yeah. Great, thank you. I think we've, some technical issues on Marco's front. He should be able to rejoin. I think sort of going on to safety now, Emmanuel, how have you as a developer been responding to sort of the post-market safety signals we've seen with RSV?
So first of all, we are not yet post-marketing situation. So I would hope to be at that stage, but I'm not. But that being said, safety is obviously of prime importance, and it is the responsibility of any vaccine developer to put in place all the monitoring activities that are being programmed as they are delivering clinical trial to capture any safety signal as the clinical trial are being done. Now, the challenge, and it's the challenge for every new vaccine you develop, is that you start with a small number of patients, and it takes a long time before you can detect reliably very rare event. I think that's exactly what happened for Guillain-Barré syndrome, where now that let's say connection or association has been included in the label. I think of the monovalent vaccine, simply because they've been used now with millions of people, and they've been able to generate additional data. I think on that side, obviously, again, the responsibility of every manufacturer is to put in place the right plan, the right pharmacovigilance plan during the development and after the development to make sure these kind of signals are detected, and it's a responsibility to signal that to the authorities. I would finish by saying, I also think it is critical to, I would say, from authorities to ask manufacturers when they can to evaluate what could be the potential mode of action and reason why, if a link is confirmed with a specific safety event, to try to understand, because it's again for the benefit of the whole vaccine community to understand and learn from that, if there is any, let's say, mechanism that can be identified, but at least one should try.
Yes, yes. Great, thank you, Emmanuel. I think a question for you, Mark. In the case if sort of with these combination vaccines, if there is a case that durability against hMPV or PIV is, not sufficient for a lifetime dose, which is what we have now with the RSV vaccines, what happens if we have sort of a lifetime dose recommendation for RSV vaccines and then a biennial or an annual revaccination recommendation for combination vaccines? Do you think these different frequency of revaccination could affect real-world uptake of either or both vaccines? Could it create confusion? What is your stance there?
It could affect uptake. I mean, you'd probably get a higher uptake for the dose that you say, well, you get this and you're protected for life, or at least for a couple of years, compared to the one where you say, well, come back next year and we'll have to give you a new one. I guess it would also affect cost effectiveness, because if you've already got one component in the combination vaccine where you're already protected, basically you're saying, well, give this combination vaccine simply for the other two components because you don't need protection anymore from the first component. So the combination vaccine will have to be cost effective based on those other two components alone. So that's going to reduce the benefit, but the cost is going to be the same. And so whether that would still be cost effective is an important question.
Thank you. That's very insightful. Hi, Marco. We're great to see that you're back. We're currently discussing vaccine safety at the moment. So especially sort of with the increasing evidence of Guillain-Barré syndrome in the US, I think I'd like to ask you, as someone at the EMA, how would you say evidence around safety is weighted in regulatory decisions relative to other decision-making bodies such as the US ACIP? Have you had these signals greatly influence your thinking on revaccination, expanded age eligibility, and long-term planning?
Yeah, well, safety is always extremely important and paramount in our evaluation as a regulatory body. So that is without any doubt. Of course, we will, as always, we will need to really understand and monitor carefully what kind of safety signals are emerging, what is the incidence of this adverse event following immunization, and what ultimately the impact on the benefit-risk balance, because that's what we care the most. And therefore, we will need really to understand if with any combination vaccine, there is an increased occurrence of such adverse event. Keeping in mind that the pre-approval clinical data package will not be able to tell us a lot, because these are rare or very rare adverse events, and we should not forget about this aspect. So we will need post-approval study to really understand exactly what is the incidence when they're occurring. Keeping in mind that also this vaccine could protect from the occurrence of these neurological conditions that are due from the spread of the viruses. So as we've seen also with influenza, we always need to put in context also what the vaccine might be causing versus what the vaccine might be preventing in terms of occurrence of these conditions such as Guillain-Barré syndrome. So definitely an important area to be discussed since early phases of development of the vaccines, particularly for combination vaccine. But I don't think this should be seen as a showstopper at all, but simply something that needs to be followed up, need to be monitored, and need to be, carefully then described in the product information so that everybody is aware about its occurrence, its incidence, and of course, those that have to take decision or recommendation will know what is the impact of this adverse event if they are occurring.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Thank you. And so you're really emphasizing then that it's the real world post-licensure surveillance data that will be important for this.
Yeah, but of course, it's always a matter of understanding the incidence and what is the impact on the benefit-risk balance at the end of the day. So it's not like if you see, very rare cases of GBS occurring, that this is necessarily a major problem for the vaccine. So it's simply something that we need to be aware. We need to see how to minimize that, but does not necessarily mean that the vaccine, has no real impact. On the contrary.
Great. And just from your sort of point of view, from a regulatory lens, would you be able to give us a hint as to what you think could be decided upon for RSV revaccination recommendations in the future? Do you think it will remain as a lifetime dose, biennial, triennial?
Well, nobody has a crystal ball, so it's very difficult to say. But what we do is really to take into account the evidence available, and based on that, update our recommendations. So our approach has been very pragmatic since the beginning. We approve based on a single dose because we have data on a single dose and it seems to be covering for the period for which we have evidence. And then, once evidence will accumulate over the years, we will decide whether there might be a point in time in which it will be right to say now it's time to revaccination, or maybe not. It's very difficult to say, but we have to remain evidence-based. We need really to understand what all the data are telling us, and only then we will be able to update our recommendations.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. Great. So in terms of market adoption and awareness and equity, Emmanuel, with the sort of limited awareness around hMPV and PIV, what do you believe will drive uptake for these combination vaccines?
I think there are two aspects. One that we already covered briefly, which is continuing to invest, let's say, and private company can do that, but also actually public effort to understand, characterize the epidemiology. And obviously, the most important part of the epidemiology of these viruses are all the severe infection that send people to hospital, drive the use of antibiotic. And it's something we often forget to speak, but antibiotic resistance is a major issue, and preventing the use of antibiotic is often a major value if the intervention indeed prevent the use of antibiotics. But beyond understanding the real impact across the world of these viruses, there is another aspect in vaccine manufacturing that is critical, is that you need to invest in technologies that allows you to produce a massive amount of doses at extremely low cost, because then it really allows you to deploy a strategy of what we call tiered pricing, where actually the poorest will actually pay really extremely low price to get access to this vaccine, and you basically apply a different formula in countries that have a much higher income. And these strategies at least have been deployed for other vaccines, and shown to have major public health impact. But that really relies on the ability to select a manufacturing process that is extremely high yield, extremely simple, and potentially that you can deploy in different places in the world very easily, so that you can actually produce massive amount of doses at extremely low cost.
Great, thank you. And Mark, I know that your research is heavily focused on sort of the RSV prophylactic rollout strategies across low middle income countries and high income countries. I think relating to what Emmanuel has just said on enabling uptake in those lower middle income countries and those regions, how can we ensure that those regions really get that access to these combination vaccines?
Well, I think there's maybe two issues. One is, I think Emmanuel's alluded to, is cost. So, I mean, in terms of, I mean, we already have an RSV vaccine for a maternal RSV vaccine available. It's been There's been a WHO SAGE recommendation. It's, you know, like it, and some countries are, some low and middle income countries are already exploring taking it up. So a shift from that to a combination vaccine, if the cost differential is not very great, it might be quite an easy decision. I mean, it's like the switch between DTP, Hep B to Penta. That was, you know, a switch that has happened almost everywhere across the road because the extra amount you're paying for Penta is not that great. So if it's the same proposition, you're just paying, you know, $1 more or $2 more for the additional hMPV and PIV component, then I think it will, and there are no safety issues, I think that will make it a much easier decision. If there's a substantial cost element involved, I think then, well, I mean, we need to be sort of starting to explore the issues in low and middle income countries, which are not going to be the same in high income countries from now. What is the actual burden of disease? What's the seasonality? What are the safety risks? Because, for instance, the safety risks for RSV vaccines, maternal RSV vaccines that SAGE considered, were WHO SAGE considered, were somewhat different from the ones, for instance, that were considered by FDA or EMA or ACIP or so forth. So a sort of different considerations. What's access to care in these settings? So I think we need to start doing those studies now and seeing, you know, at a time when actually the resources for global health and vaccine access are particularly tight. Is this going to be a good use of the limited resources? So, yeah.
Yeah, great point. Thank you. And for Emmanuel and Marco, I think we spoke about this previously with regards to epidemiology, but in terms of how we can increase market adoption across different countries, do you think that launch strategies could be adapted by regions? Do you see realistically different countries having sort of different rollout schedules purely based on how these viruses align in their seasons?
I don't know. You want to start, Emmanuel, or
I can try, but in a way, I think I will repeat myself by simply stating that launching a vaccine is already something extremely challenging. You need to introduce a new concept to people. And it needs to be really simple, straightforward, and the benefits of adding that new thing to their life has to be obvious, and it needs to be as simple as possible. So I would have some difficulty to imagine that you would launch a vaccine, you know, at different moments in the year, depending on the region. And depending on the seasonality, some regions of the world are known to be where there is actually no season. These viruses circulate across the year. So that goes back to, in a way, setting a target product profile that delivers a vaccine that is really outperforming natural infection. So that provides, I would say, multi-year protection. You know, actually, an interesting set of new knowledge, I would say, is what we call challenge trial. The learning you can make from this trial is that, for example, if you challenge someone with RSV, these people have a 2 to 3-fold increase in antibody. So the vaccines are rather increasing the antibody response, neutralizing between 10 to 15. And so I think, you know, a very pragmatic and empirical way of considering what should be achieved by these vaccines is actually very high rate of fold increase, way much more than actually what you get with a natural infection, so that you get that multi-year protection. And if you have multi-year protection, you can actually implement the new concept of the vaccine and to be used whenever people want across the year, which again would be very simple and potentially remove the crowd, let's say the I think there is already too many vaccines that needs to be given at the beginning of season. So if you can actually give the vaccine at another moment of the season, you will also increase coverage and compliance.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, and if I can add, I think, it's too early to say, we have to advance these vaccines, understand how they perform, doing more AP studies in different parts of the world to have a better picture. And only then it will be possible to have a better idea on how to use them. And of course, as always, combination vaccines offer a great advantage. I'm struggling to see that something like parainfluenza can go as a standalone vaccine. So it's important not to forget these aspects. But as always with combination, it's you could have hiccups down the road, and you have to be prepared, maybe in changing the type of combination you're thinking of, and that's something that we have to be prepared. But only by advancing vaccine development we will understand that. And of course, we would hope that will be in the type of scenario that Emmanuel was mentioning, like all the different antigens providing long-term protection. That of course will make things easier. But if we are not in that type of scenario, then we have to think what alternative to bring in, and maybe parainfluenza should be combined with influenza or with something else. So we have to be prepared to switch strategy. But there is one thing that I completely agree and I would like to support is the concept that we should stop in going one by one with all new vaccines. It's already too crowded with the vaccination schedule, not only in infancies, but also now in the elderly, and in pregnant women. So we need to think about how we can combine antigens into single shots. And this might not be easy, but we all need to put effort because this is in the interest of public health.
Definitely. Thank you, Marco. I think before we move on to the questions from the audience, I just have a final question to you all. How do we ensure ultimately that high-risk populations, especially in those in low and middle-income countries, where we know that the majority of RSV and hMPV morbidity and mortality is concentrated, how do we ensure that they gain timely and equitable access to these combination vaccines? I'll start with you, Mark. You've already answered this quite a lot, but I'll ask you again.
Yeah, I mean, I've addressed the issues around sort of knowledge, data of what's happening. I guess the elephant in the room is really funding. So, I mean, I think we live in a world where, like in the past, many low and lower middle income countries introduced vaccines something like a decade or so later than high income countries because of lack of access, lack of funding, prices that weren't like at the level that they could attain, and also, just lack of funding to purchase and to deliver the vaccines. Since Gavi has started working in this field, and manufacturers have moved more to sort of tiered pricing, especially with low prices for Gavi, we've seen a great improvement in this. It's not perfect, but we've seen an improvement. I think now with the sort of global health funding resources diminishing, I think this model we've had, which was not perfect, but at least moving in the right direction, is being threatened. So I think it is so important to make sure that we are able to maintain a model, both from the supply side, where we are able to offer good prices to countries that will not be able to afford high prices, but also that we can pool our resources and understands that, infectious diseases are the responsibility of everyone in the world. It's not like, like just we can just leave countries to deal with their own problems if they're resource poor countries, because that will ultimately affect all of us when it comes to infectious diseases. So that's really so important.
Thank you. Emmanuel, would you like to answer that?
So I mean, it's going to be a small repetition, but still it's actually really critical. First of all, generate the data in this population. Secondly, as I said, select manufacturing strategy that are compatible with extremely low cost of goods, which give maximum flexibility in terms of volumes and very low price. Develop presentation that are thermostable if it's possible. and that are very easy that facilitate the administration. WHO pre-qualification needs to be part of the overall regulatory strategy, and engagement, obviously, of entities like Gavi it should also be part of, I would say, the whole commercial engagement. But again, I mean, on the other hand, if you cannot produce this vaccine at very low cost, and if it's not thermostable, you can end up nowhere, basically, in this discussion. So these are, if it's achievable to have this characteristic of vaccine, one should move ahead with this strategy.
Thank you, Emmanuel. And Marco, do you have anything to add?
No, I agree with all that's been said. I think, trying to summarize, we need to have good data on the impact also in LMIC, because that is always the starting point, and we always don't have very good data to start with. So that is really crucial. Then, of course, thinking about, what is the cost of the vaccines and the manufacturing capacity they could deliver and the funding through Gavi, it's always important. And, as said, also, there is a regulatory aspect that is equally important, because sometimes I hear too often that, there is no approval or pre-qualification by WHO because, nobody's there to support and to fund the vaccination campaigns, which is a bit of a vicious circle. And we need to break this. We need to make sure that we advance as rapidly as possible approval in countries in need of new vaccines, and foster how pre-qualification can really be an enhancer here in allowing a rapid approval of these vaccines.
Thank you so much. Yes, and I think the recent pre-qualification of Vicebio will be a great step for enabling RSV immunization to reach the high need. Thank you. So I think that wraps up the panel discussion. I think we have a lot of questions in the question and answer box from the attendees. I will ask about, firstly, we have a question regarding the design of phase 3 trials. So for Emmanuel and Marco, perhaps, what are your perspectives on the design of phase 3 trials for combination vaccines? Can we use controlled human infection models as a marker of efficacy?
I would let Marco start.
Thank you, Emmanuel. So yeah, I think in principle, for any new antigen of this kind, respiratory virus, we will need some demonstration of efficacy in field clinical trial. That's, is the current way of looking at this. But I would like to add a couple of points. First of all, I agree that human challenge models can be extremely helpful, and we've seen with RSV particularly that have been quite good in telling us which vaccine were going to be effective. So definitely something to add, maybe not straight away as pivotal evidence, but really a supportive evidence of the performance of a vaccine. And then maybe the other very important point that we often discuss when it comes to combination vaccine is the type of syndromic approach in which you have an efficacy clinical trials in which you look into a composite outcome, for example, bronchiolitis, caused by all the different antigens contained in your vaccine. And that could be your primary endpoint that contain, with subgroup analysis for each specific pathogen, plus the support of human challenge models and immunogenicity study. I do think that this could provide a suitable package, that could allow approval. Again, I'm expressing a personal point of view, and of course, all of this will have to be discussed formally with the regulatory agencies on a case-by-case basis. But I strongly believe that in the future, when we go with the syndromic approach and we add on new antigens, it's very difficult to provide efficacy for each one of them, and we need to be a bit reasonable here.
Yes, that's a very good point. Emmanuel?
Yeah, it's obviously a highly important and strategic discussion where developer needs to engage regulators, and so I'm actually I cannot agree more with what was said. The only thing I'm going to add is that let's be clear, the phase 3 for the monovalent RSV vaccine were already very large trial of 20 to 30,000 people. So this is a massive investment at risk. for a combination vaccine, we should expect this trial to be at least as big, if not slightly bigger. So it will, again, be a massive investment. I'm actually really interested to hear that the result of human challenge trial, in addition to, let's say, secondary endpoint that would be strain specific, could be considered as supportive evidence. I would say that human challenge trial can also be used as a way to de-risk the massive phase 3 investment that has to be made. As Marco said, on the RSV front, it's very clear that those that have been able to show high level of efficacy in phase 3, some of them showed a very high level of efficacy in the challenge trial. So I think we actually have today in vaccine development a new tool that is getting more and more well done. Clearly, it's an opportunity not only to de-risk, but potentially indeed to generate efficacy evidence that can be part of a complete package of evidence supporting the benefit of an intervention.
Thank you. Yeah, just following on from that, I think hVivo's presentation of results from their human challenge model at ISRV was very insightful, and we saw results like hMPV onset usually occurring after RSV. Sort of insights like that be very informative. So yeah, agree with you there. Thank you. Mark, I have a question for you. Now that we're seeing more and more RSV prophylaxis being rolled out, do you think if we continue to see high levels of bronchiolitis, do you think this would help improve the awareness of other viruses like hMPV and PIV? Do you believe that this could help increase testing patterns for these viruses?
I think it's possible. I mean, awareness will grow. I think another thing that hopefully might happen is, I think the way viral surveillance of respiratory viruses has worked in the world is really, we started with influenza, and that's understandable. I mean, there's concerns about influenza because it has pandemic potential and because we need to reformulate the vaccine every year to understand how to produce the vaccine. So there has been global influenza surveillance networks. And then in the last 10 years or so, RSV was added to some of these influenza surveillance systems because there was a growing awareness that actually RSV has a high burden too, especially in low and middle income countries. I think as we start to look at other antigens like hMPV, maybe it's time to say not that, okay, what's the next highest burden? Let's start surveillance systems on there, even if it's piggybacking on our existing ones, but say, can we actually understand the sort of drivers, both viral and bacterial, of, you know, acute respiratory illness, or at least lower respiratory tract illness more generally, and so really test for a variety of pathogens. And I think that will, in the long term, it will save money rather than sort of like having these very vertical systems. And also we'll understand the interactions between the different pathogens, how seasonality in different parts of the world is affected. I think we'll have a better understanding overall of burden in epidemiology if we start looking across sort of drivers of LRTI rather than just do one pathogen at a time.
Yes, I agree with you there. Thank you. And we have another question regarding combination vaccines in the pediatric setting. I mean, historically, we know that pediatric vaccine development for RSV has been very difficult. I don't know, Marco, if you'd like to answer this one. What do you see for the pediatric space in terms of combination vaccines?
Yeah, I cannot deny that this at the moment is a difficult area because, you know, what we've seen emerging with RSV, I don't think we really understand that. But there are some concerns indeed that in that type of population, so, you know, seronegative toddlers, there is a risk that the vaccine is not working sufficiently or maybe even be detrimental, even if I don't think, you know, we can confirm that with these new vaccines. But of course, you know, it's an important signal. And this creates a bit of a burden in advancing combination vaccine that include RSV, maybe with MPV or others, you know, in this population, which of course is a target population, because we know that MPV circulates a lot in this age range, or, you know, before 5 years of age, and parainfluenza as well. So it would be clearly a target population, but here I have to admit is a bit more complex So here we would urge companies to talk regularly to the regulators about what they intend to do, what kind of evidence they can provide to the risk clinical trials here, and when would be the right timing to start studies in this age bracket. That's probably all I can say for the time being. I think, we should not look at what happened recently with one vaccine as really saying that we should stop development in this age. But I think we need to take the learning from that case and to really understand what are the implications for the future and how we can do better in predict how to make sure that, children in clinical trials are protected and we are moving in an ethical way in investigating these vaccines.
Yes, definitely.
Let me add one or 2 points here. It is definitely a more challenging area. First of all, children are naive against these viruses, except the antibodies they have from the mother. And less is known on the ability of subunit vaccine to confer the right level of protection. There is another challenge if you want to protect, especially the newborn between 0 and 6 months, is that, for example, for RSV, the peak, the burden of disease happens at 2 months of age. And so you don't have much space to basically immunize a naive children between 0 and 2 months, which really drove the development of maternal vaccine. And maternal immunization is used to protect newborns against pertussis, against RSV now, and possibly with multivalent combination vaccine, you could add protection against hMPV and PIV, at least for the first 6 months of life. I think we are lacking a little bit epidemiological data to understand how big is the relative contribution of RSV, hMPV, and PIV3 in that age segment. But if confirmed, that might be the safest and easiest route to basically protect efficiently from day 0 the newborn, for protecting them against these diseases.
Great. Thank you. We have a question regarding the epidemiology of the different diseases. So Mark, would you be able to answer this one? Do you have an idea as to what the impact of RSV prophylaxis could be on the epidemiology of hMPV and PIV, particularly their dynamics in terms of circulation and transmission?
I don't know specifically, maybe the others might, but I mean, I can think there could be a number of consequences. One is, if we have flu, RSV, COVID vaccination, we'll start to see, what are the remaining drivers of respiratory disease, and so understand the pathogens and the epidemiology of the pathogens causing those more. Second of all, there might be some sort of interaction between them. I mean, it could go in either direction. For instance, we've seen there's a lot of interaction between flu and pneumococcus, for instance. If you get one, you might more likely to get the other, and it might be more severe, and it works in both directions. So it might be that preventing RSV might also prevent respiratory disease from other pathogens. And there's sort of hints of that in some of the RSV vaccine trials where they saw a larger decrease in pneumonia than they were expecting in some of the trials. I think the jury's still out. We still need to explore this a lot more. It could even work the other way. I mean, it could be that there's some interaction in immunity post-natural infection, but that is very speculative. I mean, it's just that there's a possibility it could work in both directions. I think either way is still, the jury's still out.
Yes, I don't know if Emmanuel or Marco, you have any thoughts on potential replacement by hMPV and PIV now that we have such widespread rollout of RSV, MABs, and vaccines. Do you think this is possible?
I don't know.
Everything is
It's difficult to say at this stage, and we will need to collect more data, and I think at this stage is very premature. But one thing that could happen is that indeed, because of maternal vaccination, the use of monoclonal, we may see a shift of the incidence of RSV to older kids. And that's also something important to keep in mind, that brings us back to the discussion on how to develop, RSV vaccine for toddlers and young children below 5 years of age, because that is something that could happen.
Yeah, no, everything is possible in terms of replacement of pathogen A by pathogen B. If you start protecting against pathogen A, I mean, there is a well-known phenomenon on Streptococcus pneumoniae. But obviously that needs to be driven. I mean, what is possible is not necessarily what's going to happen. Evidence needs to be generated, and evidence-based generated as these medicine are being widely implemented.
Yeah, definitely. And I think your point about sort of shift of burden to the toddlers is very interesting, because we saw some data on that at ISRV in Galicia, second season rollout of nirsevimab. We saw actually higher hospitalizations in 2 to 5 year olds. So we'll need to keep an eye on that, definitely, and it might strengthen the case for pediatric vaccine development. We have another question in terms of the prevalence of all 3 viruses. So an attendee has asked, is there enough prevalence for all 3 viruses in the elderly population to justify vaccine development? Does the burden ultimately warrant vaccine development? And if you could give some details on the burden.
I can start. I think I don't know the answer yet. It's not yes or no, but I think like WHO has recently introduced a new sort of concept in sort of vaccine sort of an analysis and evaluation called the full value of vaccines assessment. And the idea is it has a lot of concepts in it, but part of the idea is that the investigation on what the impact and economic and health value of a vaccine, all that should not start when the vaccine has already reached the market, because there's no point telling the manufacturer, oh, thank you for spending $1 billion developing this vaccine. Actually, we don't really need it, right? That's not the time to have this conversation. But actually at the development stage, already start doing the studies on what's the market, what's the burden of disease, what's the potential vaccine impact and cost effectiveness, what's the willingness to pay, acceptability, and so forth. So I think that's, I mean, not just for WHO, I think that's, high income countries too. Now is the time to start doing the studies and saying, okay, can we justify the development of these different vaccines or combination vaccines, and maybe have the conversations now, which will either accelerate development if the signal is, yes, we need these vaccines and this is how much we'll pay for it, or stop us from developing vaccines that won't have a market.
Thank you, Mark. Okay, I think we have another question on monoclonal antibodies in newborns versus maternal immunization. So Marco and Emmanuel, what are your thoughts in terms of these 2 immunization approaches? Do you believe that there are specific settings or population groups where MABs could have an advantage in immunization over vaccines?
Yeah, I think if I can start, I think honestly, maternal immunization and use of monoclonals in the newborn seems like a very good strategy, because indeed, also Emmanuel already mentioned, the schedule is very crowded, and going into a vaccination at 2 months is complicated, and you still have some maternal antibodies, or you may have maternal antibodies. So it's a very complex endeavor, and I really see that, the positioning of these 2 strategies are important and relevant. So for active immunization, I would really go into other type of groups, the elderly and older kids definitely will be the preference.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would add that I've been personally very impressed by the performance of the monoclonal antibody. It's a huge success, and it has already clearly demonstrated its value in preventing the hospitalization of many children. So it's a highly effective intervention. The unknown of that intervention is that, is RSV an exception,
Great, thank you. I think we have one more question from the audience. So I think this is directed to everyone here. What is your interpretation of the enhanced disease observed in Moderna's discontinued RSV hMPV pediatric trial? Does this have ramifications for other candidate platforms or indicated populations? And following on from that, do you think it could impact older adult vaccines?
I think we already discussed this a little bit, and we need to understand better what happened there and to have full clarity if we are really talking about enhancement of disease or, you know, a vaccine that was not sufficiently protective. The numbers are very small, so we should be careful in not drawing too strong conclusion, you know, without really good evidence. But of course, you know, is an alarm bell, and we need to really think about also all the type of preclinical models that we're using to de-risk these programs in these ages. Are they good enough, or should we revisit them, or should we rethink how we generate evidence that could inform us about whether a vaccine, you know, could present such type of risk when going into a seronegative population of very young children? So it's work in progress. But I completely agree, this is important and should not underestimate it. And we really need to find a way forward here, because as said, you know, this is a population that might really be in need of a vaccine. And again, monoclonal antibodies can be used over several seasons, probably. But how far should we go with that? I don't know. So it's good that we think about an alternative that, you know, after we go beyond the first year of life, maybe we use another strategy.
Yeah, I don't have much more to say. Small number, careful about coming with final conclusion. There is a signal. This needs to be investigated. It is this type of situation that already complexified dramatically the development of RSV vaccine for 50 years. The catch-22 situation is that I think authorities have put a pause of development of vaccine in that specific age segment, so there will be no more additional data. So that's a little bit the challenge we are facing here. But fundamentally, obviously, we have to acknowledge that we are trying to use subunit vaccine here, whether it's delivered, whatever the platform in a way, in a naive immune setting. And that might be very different from going into humans that have been naturally primed against the same virus, for which there is a background immunity and for which you simply increase one component of that background immunity. It's a challenging situation. I'm sure regulators are continuing to evaluate this situation very carefully. And I would say when there is a medical need somewhere, at one point, we need to try to come with solution to that medical need. So if the medical need continues to be confirmed at one point, one will have to take the risk again, maybe with a very clever clinical trial design that really minimize the risk taken.
Yes, thank you, Emmanuel. Yeah, I think ultimately in the development of these, whether standalone or combination vaccines, it will ultimately be important to demonstrate benefit outweighing the risk. So yeah, we'll have to wait and see. But thank you very much, everyone. I think that was the last question. I just want to say a big thank you to our panelists who have shared their great insights today and their expertise. Thank you also to everyone who's signed up and watched and for their questions. As I've mentioned, this will be available on demand, will be sent to your emails afterwards, and will be on our YouTube channel. But that concludes our webinar for today. So thank you, Emmanuel, Mark, and Marco. It was really great to have you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.
Bye.